All right, perfect. So I guess we'll just keep going here to kind of ground us.
We shall resume.
We shall resume from about the 4th chapter on the institutional spectrum. So this is where, as Andrew alluded to a little earlier, he gives us the distinction between convivial and what is the other term?
Manipulative.
Manipulative, exactly. Yeah. And this comes out in kind of the same way we might think of a political spectrum, right? Where we have some institutions that are more convivial on the left. That's no coincidence.
Right.
And then on the right we have schooling, we have the military, and we have all of and then we have law enforcement, all of these types of things. But he gets into kind of weird territory because he puts things like sidewalks on the left, like a random choice. Like sidewalks are an institutional formation, or highways. Maybe, how highways work in such a way.
So, there are two differences, I think. The manipulative institutions are there because they want to preordain use of them, and they want to function in a way that forces you to use them in a particular manner. Whereas convivial institutions are characterized by spontaneity. So,
right.
The sidewalk, what do you use when you're going down the sidewalk?
What do I use?
And what do you use?
The ground. Or
you use your own legs.
Oh, I see. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everything you need for the sidewalk, you have within yourself.
Right.
Whereas with the highway, what do you need for that?
Cars.
You need a car. So it's a way of preparing you. Okay, let me rephrase this. It's an institution that comes with a need that you have to gain access to this institution.
Right.
You need to have a car to use a highway.
Yeah.
Whereas with a convivial institution, everything that you have already, everything you are already, is enough to participate in them.
Yeah, exactly. And he then draws something of a connect between highways and between schools, because they both are kind of lead to the same thing, or all roads lead to the school, where he says General Motors and Ford produce means of transportation, but they also, and more importantly, manipulate public taste in such a way that the need for transportation is expressed as a demand for private cars rather than public buses. So in that way, and the only way that people can afford private cars is, of course, if they've gone through the gauntlet of education and, jump through all the hoops.
Oh, yes. I never thought about it this way, but that's a very good observation.
And a lot of poor people have cars, but we know that there's no one outside of this system. If they are poor and have a car, it's because of some kind of other institutional situation. But I find it funny. So on the left, the extreme left, he has examples like bakeries and hairdressers. Then on the extreme right, he has schools and hospitals. And then in the middle, he's like hotels and cafeterias. It seems like some random...
because in the middle, hotels and cafeterias are serving other people.
Yeah, I understand. I just don't know why...
For their needs.
Yeah.
On the right, you're serving people for manufactured needs. And on the far left, you're... What does he list on the far left again?
Bakeries and hairdressers.
And hairdressers, because people come in and ask for what they want.
Yeah. Yeah.
What I mean, institution. I will come back to words eventually. What I'm interested in is the false public utilities idea, which he gets to with the highways. As an example, it leads to school. On page 86 in my edition, we have different editions, which It's unfortunate. But he says, of all false utilities, school is the most insidious. Highway systems produce only a demand for cars. Schools create a demand for the entire set of modern institutions which crowd the right end of the spectrum. So with highways, there is a specific needs that, or demands that gets produced by this particular institution, whereas school is an institution that inculcates a need for all institutions. It's kind of a general element in this sense. And then he talks about what happens to the people who question these needs or these demands. A man who questions the need for highways would be written off as a romantic. The man who questions the need for school is immediately attacked as either heartless or imperialist.
Right. And so in that way,
whereas for Illich, to talk about school or the need for school is the opposite. Hang on. Sorry. I got caught up in my own rhetoric and I forgot about the truth.
Sophist.
Exactly. When Illich is talking about it, the need for school is heartless or imperialist. So it's flipped around. So we have this false consciousness that makes us believe that anyone who says that people shouldn't be educated in a certain way in a particular nation is, someone who's trying to perpetuate poverty, or someone who's trying to make sure that a nation has a dependency on what normally characterizes imperial nations.
Right. So another way of thinking about how you just characterize that need for cars, or how people consider those people that criticize highways, written off,
It seems insane. It seems insane.
Yeah.
Imagine someone told you, we don't need roads or streets. That seems ridiculous.
Yeah.
Because all of the society we live in is dependent on there being streets, there being highways, because people own cars. People need to get to places, and people are expected to get to places at a particular time because they can take advantage of a car, or they can take a Greyhound, or they can take a train, or they can take an aeroplane. As soon as you institutionalize a certain thing, and everyone expects people to conform to that institutionalized value. This is Illich's whole complaint of we didn't realize that we've been fucked over without realizing it. And no, you go. I'll nibble some pumpkin seeds while you.
What he says about the phenomenon of cars is that the man who does not who does not own a car in Los Angeles may be almost immobilized, but if he can somehow manage to reach a workplace, he can get a hold of a job. The school dropout has no alternative route. Essentially, the way, and it's interesting to think about it in the way you just said it, because it would seem as though highways, cars, it seems to be a more pervasive system than schools itself, where I can imagine people getting by without going through school. They'll just get a job and then be looked down upon by the majority of everyone else, which is its own problem, clearly. But if people can't get around because they can't get a car, and this is certainly the way that this city is working right now, where infrastructure is being put in place in order to allow more people to come in with their cars. But that doesn't make any sense, right? Because it's not sustainable. In 20 years, if everyone, is coming in with their cars, there's no amount of growth that can possibly accommodate that kind of hypothetical endpoint. So it seems to me as though the highway or the notion of roads or cars are a more all-pervading system than schools. be curious to see what you know.
Well, I
say
think
about that.
it's important that you use this Los Angeles as an example there, because no one walks in Los Angeles. The public transit system in Los Angeles is shit. It gets shat on all the time. So I mean, if he was writing about Vancouver or Montreal at the moment, then it would not be the same. It would not be the same analogy,
Right.
I think,
Mhm.
because there is an assumption in Los Angeles that you need to have a car to get around, because Los Angeles is such a massive city. It's all connected by roads. It can't be serviced by one transit system alone. So he's using this as like an extreme example of what you need to do to have a car, and he's saying it's even harder to get by in a schooled society. It's even harder to get by in a schooled society. Well, wait, okay, sorry, I completely fucked this up. It's harder to get by in a schooled society than it is to get by without a car in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
It's a sort of comic comparison,
Right.
in a sense. I don't think he's making a general judgment about getting by without a car in modern society in general. And also bear in mind that this is written at a time where public transit was not in the same state it was nowadays.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, neither of us own a car.
Yeah.
And we get to buy... I get around in London pretty easily without a car.
Yeah.
And this is also before ride sharing, too. So maybe the analogy doesn't really stand in our age.
But I understand.
I get what you mean about. Actually, no, I don't know. There's certain jobs that you excluded from if you don't have a driver's license.
Yeah, that's true.
Sure,
that's true. Yeah. So the big for him, he almost sees there at one moment to be the possibility of reforming the notion of school, and I'm saying that very loosely because his entire project is around this idea of deschooling society.
Yeah.
But I think kind of on the horizon, he sees the possibility that there can be a kind of schooling that fosters many of the things that he says. Where a school, we might be able to consider it as that zone where, as we figured it as like a dating app, where people who had common interests can get together, like an agora or an atrium or something like that, could in a sense be a school where people could actually choose to be taught by someone who they've effectively agreed upon has knowledge about this, rather than it being someone mandated by the state, mandated by any other kind of authority. So his one of his big challenges then is against the idea of compulsory learning, right? Mm-hmm. So this is, moving into the next section.
Totally, yeah. He
says that compulsory learning cannot be liberal, right? So he wants people to have that choice, which seems pretty reasonable in how we've been talking about it so far. But do you think then, because his language is kind of loose, because he says compulsory learning cannot be a liberal enterprise, whereas for me, I understand the notion of learning as being tied to kind of education in a broad sense, where I could learn from a mechanic how to do, something with a car or whatever, someone who knows about that. And I wouldn't necessarily condemn learning in that sphere, but rather it's that kind of implicit attachment to the school as it has been made manifest in the kind of oppressive way as he's laid it out. And I'd be curious what you think about that, if there is not only a possibility for school to actually be liberal in the atrium type way, or if not.
Well, so you're let me understand this right. Your question is, can education be liberal without undermining skills?
Yes. Yes. Where you could have learning in the sense that you have a mechanic teach you or something, or some kind of expert or professional in some field. And could it be liberal in that way?
Because the predominant understanding in liberal arts theorizing, as it extends to this day, is that the liberal arts are useless, and that's why they're useful.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I want to go all the way back. I'm sorry to take us back.
You should.
To why we must disestablish school. To one of my favourite sections of the book, where he writes, both the exchange of skill and the matching of partners are based on the assumption that education for all means education by all.
Right.
Not the draft into a specialised institution, but only the mobilisation of the whole population can lead to popular culture. And this is this then feeds into his commentary on what incidental or informal education means, which is informed by his understanding of the history of apprenticeship, the history of mentorship from his medievalist background. It's a whole paragraph. Do you mind if I read the whole paragraph?
Please.
Okay. Incidental education can not any longer return to the forms which learning took in the village or the medieval town. Traditional society was more like a set of concentric circles of meaningful structures, while modern man must learn how to find meaning in many structures to which he is only marginally related. This is the whole hierarchy within institutions.
Yeah.
In a village, language and architecture and work and religion and family customs were consistent with one another, mutually explanatory and reinforcing. To grow into one implied a growth into the others. Even specialized apprenticeship was a byproduct of specialized activities, such as shoemaking or the singing of psalms. If an apprenticeship never became a master or a scholar, he still contributed to making shoes or to making church services solemn. Education did not compete for time with either work or leisure. Almost all education was complex, lifelong, and unplanned. And I think when he's talking about a liberal education, he's talking about an education that is governed by institutions that were established under a liberal bourgeois society.
Right.
Which meant that they were detached from the everyday life of ordinary people. Which in turn established a hierarchy between mental and manual labour. This was obviously borrowed from the Greeks and reintroduced in Renaissance society, which influenced the Enlightenment very prominently. So when he's talking about Deschooling, he's talking about a form of education that's very integrated in what the society is.
Right.
And with skill exchanges, it's a way of dissolving the division between intellectual education and vocational education.
Exactly. So when he says two things kind of pertaining to that, notably the way that the rest of society has become a school to some extent. He says,
well institutionalized, yeah.
He says all educators are ready to conspire to push out the walls of the classroom with the goal of transforming the entire culture into a school. And then in giving us kind of a, there are little glimmers of hope kind of sprinkled in here. He says that Our present educational institutions are at the service of the teacher's goals. The relational structures we need are those which will enable each man to define himself by learning and by contributing to the learning of others. So in that way, like you said, how it would be kind of like a reciprocal process, right? Where it's not simply those people granted the status of teachers and those people then therefore granted the status of, or forced upon them the status of pupil or student.
Right.
But it being more of a fluid dynamic where who's to say that this child cannot teach me something about, who knows? Today, I don't know, video games as a silly example, or can't teach me something about compassion or friendship or something like that I wouldn't be able to learn anywhere else. So yeah, in that way, like thinking about the possibility of there being that that kind of new school, which I feel like he kind of works to, but
let's bear in mind that he was trained as a priest, and one of the key stories in Christianity is the story of Jesus going to the rabbis as a 12-year-old and teaching them about Scripture.
Right.
There is no way to measure who deserves to be a teacher and who deserves to be a learner, because, let's go back to our conversation about rent, right? And the concept of natality.
Mm-hmm.
There is always a constant and relentless introduction of the new into the world. And although we may attribute authority to the rules of those who came before us, no one can really anticipate or control the disruptions of the new. I think this is part of Illich's critique of the school, is that it doesn't anticipate anything new. It has this kind of I think we can distinguish between the new and the repetition of the same.
Yep.
Which is part of his idea of the ritualization of progress. It seems like we're moving forward, but we're just doing the same thing over and over again.
Exactly.
In more like a seemingly original ways, whereas the real new is the disruption, it's the rupture, it's the unexpected.
Yeah.
I think that's what Illich wants us to form convivial institutions that allow us to cultivate a kind of cultivate a kind of mentorship between those who know more about a particular skill and those who want to know it, because there is a sense of an inheritance of knowledge of people who came before, but at the same extent you need to accommodate creativity within that, of a way of creating new forms that the old guard just didn't anticipate.
Yeah.
Because there is a risk with deschooling. Well, let me think about this. A risk with deschooling is that you end up with teachers who learnt under schooling.
Like a residue of the old system?
Yes.
Okay.
And then you end up repeating what already occurred, or replicating what you're trying to avoid.
Right.
Like how do you unlearn learning, and how do you deschool schooling?
Yeah.
Because surely the people who end up being the mentors for people who want to learn under this deschooled system would have been educated under a schooled system or a schooled society. And how do you avoid replicating those dynamics?
Right, and there are a number of things to do, because he gives a kind of schematic as to what that would look like. But he says, like, one of these things is that you empower all who want to share what they know to find those who want to learn it from them.
Oh, this is the three points, right?
The 3 purposes of
the general characteristics of new formal educational institutions. I should have popped that over there.
So, to read the 3 of them, they go as follows. It should provide all who want to learn with access to available resources at any time in their lives.
Which is juxtaposed with age in the phenomenology of school.
There you go. Empower all who want to share what they know to find those who want to learn it from them.
Which is juxtaposed with teachers and pupils earlier in the phenomenology of school.
And finally, furnish all who want to present an issue to the public with the opportunity to make their challenge known.
Which is juxtaposed to full-time attendance, because it's just the repetition of the curriculum over and over again to each class.
And thinking about the second one, where we empower those people who want to share what they know, that would demand getting rid of our entire institutional understanding of childhood, right? Because we automatically associate with childhood with children that they don't have the ability to do this, right? So, of course, getting at the idea of schooling is certainly a good place to start. But it would seem as though this would need to run parallel to the project of getting rid of, for example.
That was probably very loud. I'm sorry, listeners. I'm very, very drunk.
How else would we be able to talk about this?
Indeed. I was about to say this, but after talking to you when I'm very, very drunk, all I can think of is I just should rock up the seminars completely wankered. And then I'd be able to I'd definitely get a participation grade. Anyway, continue.
Right. I was just saying that it would seem as though this project needs to run parallel to the destructuration, or the kind of deconstruction of the notion of deconstruction in a very broad sense, not in the Derridian sense, of this idea of childhood. People use that term too loosely sometimes, and it drives me up the wall. Right. Otherwise, how would you be able to foster this empowering?
Okay. So, I know that we talk about him and we hate him. But Jordan Peterson, right? I gave a paper on him in Boise, and about how his ideas of postmodernism come from this terrible book called Explaining Postmodernism by Stephen Hicks.
Oh, right, yeah.
And how it's ultimately about the control of the university.
Right.
And before that, I thought that the best strategy for radical left people or academics or people who are involved in critical pedagogy would be to migrate from the university into a more free school system or a deschooled idea of education. And this recent paper made me wonder of well, where would we leave the university at this point? The university would be overtaken by people who wanted to school people.
Yeah.
In the kind of ideology that Jordan Peterson purports. Also, what's interesting is that Jordan Peterson has been persuading his listeners to go to trade school to learn a trade, and all that they need to know about the humanities comes from him.
Yeah, and
so this is a perverse twist on the deschooling
that's
ideal.
A very good point. Yeah. That's interesting.
Because in certain contexts it appeals to the lowest common denominator. Because you're no longer obliged to be challenged. I know. I mean, to refer to personal experience on this, and in an attempt to back it up, a lot of people I know who did the same masters as me developed an alcohol problem, or they had to go see therapists afterwards because it was very intense. It was way too personal at certain points, and it was too overwhelming. It was not conducted in the best way. But at the same point, at the same time, rather, we all improved as writers and thinkers and readers without us really recognizing that this emotional or psychological trauma was an integral part of us becoming better writers or readers or thinkers.
Mm-hmm.
It's very intense, I think. And people like Peterson are appealing to people to become better in a way that's not too threatening.
Yeah. I would agree
And
with that.
outside of the school system, outside of the university system.
Yeah.
So it seems like it's deschooling.
Yeah.
It seems
I
like it's
understand. Yep.
deschooling.
Mm-hmm.
But the encouragement to go to trade school,
It's just another form of schooling,
it's
though.
another form of schooling.
Right.
It's another form of schooling.
It's a more...
It's a way of making sure that there's a superior who teaches you the skill. That isn't done in a... I mean, and also in a meta sense, it is a university professor at U of T telling you to go to trade school.
Yeah.
And listen to him about these more humanistic subjects.
Right.
So, in the extent that there's this kind of learning web process going on,
Yeah, good term.
in a sense,
Yeah.
it is a learning web process that just mirrors the process of schooling.
In fact, it seems to be a more extreme version of it because it seems to be more centralized, right? And there are these figures, and they are indicative of people like Peterson and other kind of... And I see this
Well, the
for the
intellectual
most
dark
part,
web, definitely.
And
And also the more innocuous sense, the Yale lectures.
Yeah. Or
Yale lecture,
PragerU, you know what that is?
Well, no, PragerU is like just an indoctrination station. But like the Yale lectures are like just sort of more neutral education.
Okay.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
I mean it's not neutral. I mean, it is basically the training of the elite. But in the sense that the professors there at least don't have an explicit political agenda in the same way as PragerU.
Yeah. Sure.
They're like, well, I mean, at Yale, they're like, I don't want to teach this undergraduate course. I'm going to do as little work as I can to teach this because I'm like faced with thousands of students and it's being videoed. I'm like, I feel fucking awkward.
Yeah.
And all of that sort of stuff. Which is different. I mean, which is definitely a form of schooling, undoubtedly, because the name Yale is attached to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas PragerU and Peterson and other people on the intellectual dark web is a form of schooling, but it tries to present itself as countercultural. And in the same way we were talking about earlier, of like conservatism is the new counterculture. And this is a threat that Illich anticipates.
Yeah.
He's like, deschooling schools and deschooling society are completely different things.
That's a good... I like that.
Because deschooling school means that you don't understand that institutions have, pervaded culture generally, whereas deschooling society means that we untangle people's dependence on institutions,
right,
and make them more accountable and more autonomous in their own communities, which is strangely enough a very autonomous position. I think.
Yeah. I think that's a very good point because, and we spoke about this right at the beginning, is that there is the possibility that this could get co-opted if you give a very kind of loose reading of it, and how many of these figures are not Illich, but these kind of online figures are perceived as being countercultural antidotes to some kind of oppressive system, however it manifests itself. always seems to mirror.
Always seems to mirror. They seem to be doing pretty well. This is the criticism they have about socialists. Of like, well, you can't be a real socialist because you're really benefiting from the system. But at the same time, they're like, oh, we can't stand this liberal system. I'm like, you're doing really well by this liberal system.
Yeah.
That you purport to oppose.
And that's exactly it. It seems to, in every part, seem to want to usher in a more oppressive form of the exact same thing they oppose, but they're willing to accept it if it means that it is one that they craft, which is already, they already live in a system they've crafted,
which is Promethean,
right? Which is there. I think, yeah. I mean, we could jump to that, but we could.
I mean, there are plenty of little details I think that are really essential to Illich's argument, but. As the listener may have gathered by this point, it's a couple of bottles of wine in.
We are there. Have you ever heard of the podcast Drunken Philosophy?
Drunken Philosophy. I once, when I was at the Edinburgh Fringe, I saw Drunken Shakespeare. There's a theatre company where the protagonist of each Shakespeare play is absolutely sozzled.
Really?
Oh yeah, absolutely, completely pissed. And everyone's trying to do like a normal Shakespeare play, but the main character is just out of their mind on alcohol. And even if they pass out, they still do the lines and try their best to go through this Shakespeare play, despite the fact that someone's unconscious because they've had so much vodka.
That does.
But Drunken Philosophy. I mean, it's also like drunk history on like. Drunk history is also another thing too.
Yeah, I'm just saying. I hope they don't sue us. I didn't advertise this as drunken though. Not that they.
Yeah. We're also talking about Illich, so no one cares. Unfortunately.
Yeah, there will be a few people, I'm sure.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe.
We'll see. I'm curious to see what happens. With
I wonder which weirdos will listen to this. But we're also the weirdos who are into Illich.
Yeah,
so.
It happen to be two people that know each other.
Well, it'll be a learning web. I mean, that's the.
Well, what are some key things? Because you mentioned there were some things you wanted to pick out, or something that stood out.
Well, I mean, there are the general characteristics of new formal educative systems, which I think, the crucial point to be made there is that it's juxtaposed to what he writes about in the phenomenology of school, even though they're about 100 pages apart. It just needs to be addressed that he's making a parallel there. And he talks about the four networks, I guess. Oh, damn. Sorry, pages are flying everywhere because I just don't have... I don't have an elastic bands that can band this edition together. David's editions are much more put together. So there are four different approaches which enable the student to gain access to any educational resource which may help him to define and achieve his own goals. This is the use of the male pronoun as universal rather than exclusive. Number one is reference services to educational objects. This is making sure that people are people can have access to resources, really. And some examples that he gives, like the resources that are reserved in libraries, rental agencies, laboratories, showrooms, like museums or theatres, or even factories, airports and farms. So these are all different services or educational objects that he lists. Skill exchanges is another network that one may gain access to. Peer matching, where someone might engage with someone who is a partner in an inquiry, or reference services to educators at large, which is kind of a directory for the addresses and self-descriptions of professionals, paraprofessionals, or freelancers. along with conditions of access to the services. So I mean, but at this point, he's like very interested in like the practical conditions of how the hell can we do school society and make sure that people still have access to people who know more than them.
Right.
However, I think the most important thing is the educational objects. The educational objects become more complicated in our own age, where things are more coded in a literal sense. In not the same way as the mechanical. Like I definitely remember summers where my brother-in-law or the neighbours were leaning over a car and trying to figure out how to adjust certain parts of it or trying to fix certain parts of it. And the presentation was right in front of you. You could see what link to watch. You could go onto it and see which particular wires match with particular wires and where that led to in the car, or particular pipes led to particular points. Think about coding. You can't figure that out in the same way. You need to go to an institution or something similar to figure out how coding works. I think definitely now, because it takes a very high level of coding to produce the sort of products that we become familiar with on our interfaces. People aren't creating websites on GeoCities anymore, that sort of thing. And where there is basic coding education, I think.
And I think that, like, in the case of cars especially, and this might be more of a conspiracy theory that I'm just going to spread, cars have been growing in where their engines are more reliant on computers to the extent that you cannot repair them locally.
Dinner's ready.
You
Sorry,
cannot.
I just bumped the bowl.
You cannot repair them locally. You have to take them into somewhere that has a pre-programmed computer that is going to be able to diagnose your issue or whatever. And how cars are designed in such a way as to make them impossible to repair without the institutional support of the company that you bought it from. Removing any possibility of a single person actually learning about the very procedures that go underneath it, unless they have the opportunity to go through quote-unquote higher education that can teach them about the software that is behind it, right? So I think that just kind of emphasizes your point, speaking about the kind of distance that is growing between people and the possibility of learning things that will give them kind of command over their world in a meaningful way. Not to say that cars are the answer, but it's just an example.
So I mean, this is something that gets raised occasionally in circles who are concerned about this sort of thing,
right?
Which are gradually diminishing. What's the difference between humanistic and technical education?
I don't know. I would give you a
oh, come on! You're an intellectual like I am.
I'd give you a terrible answer.
You'll be able to give us a spontaneous answer. You've read enough Heidegger.
No, I haven't. I have not read a lot of Heidegger.
I'm joking.
If I were to, I would first, at this point, even if we consider that question, if I consider that question in relation to Illich, it would seem as though the distinction between a kind of technical apparatus of learning and a humanistic apparatus of learning have become blurred to the extent that even those things that are considered part of what are human needs have been so filtered through a some kind of institutional paradigm, a very technical one at that.
That's very good.
That makes it so that I can't necessarily say where does the human end, where does the technical apparatuses that conduct the human begin in its institutional organization.
Indeed.
I mean, that's how I'd answer that, but
And yet, the people who decide the funding at Western still function with that notion.
Yeah.
Right? Because most of the funding for Western comes from people who want that funding to go towards technical education as we understand it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And the way that the way that humanistic learning is understood, definitely at Western University. I wouldn't want to dare to speak about other universities, but it's understood as a requirement. And when requirement is raised, obstacle is just a synonym. It's a requirement of part of the technical education that you really want, because the technical education will get you will guarantee you the paycheck.
Yeah.
So it seems a requirement because the university says, for breadth, you need to take a class in the arts humanities.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they take Japanese anime. Okay, just in case Michael is listening, Japanese anime is a great class. Harry Potter or Game of Thrones, the class on notice, or the creative writing class that's taken, is offered by the writing studies department. But it is just a requirement. It's part of schooling. It's part of you being assigned a social role within the society that you inhabit. And that's what learning is for most people.
Right. And, we shouldn't fly too close to the sun, we are... but that is a good point. The way that we make mandatory, like, those kind of humanities courses is kind of like pressure valves. And we say, like, oh, they took their one, writing course, and that's it, right? Yeah. Then they get their credit. And that's it. Like in the educational program.
Well, I found it TAing on a creative writing course, and like when I was finding it, the Theory Centre doesn't have a TA office at the moment, so I direct them to like the Theory Centre lounge. And while we were finding a place to sit over a different place, I was like, "Oh, what are you reading at the moment?" And they said, "Oh, I'm too busy to be reading at the moment." Like, but you're taking a fucking creative writing course. You should be reading.
Yeah.
So it's no longer taken as just. It's so bizarre because the way that definitely the way that I came to the humanities was from reading and just sitting in my room and turning the pages and feeling like nothing else mattered than what other people thought, what other people read, and what I thought about that, and how I might integrate, how I might change my own writing style from that. I don't see that or hear that from the people who are taking the creative writing course. Just that whole life involvement. And what Illich foresees in deschooling society is that people aren't going to be leaping into something with their whole life if you just make it an obligation.
Yep.
If you make it an obligation, then they'll be like, okay, I need to do that to get into this other institution that I'm really interested about.
Right.
Because you've institutionalized that wants to become a need.
Mm-hmm. Carrot on the end of the stick is...
Exactly. I mean, it's like that this thing should be a desire rather than a requirement. And the reason that stuff like writing or stuff like literature or stuff like the humanities is a requirement rather than a desire is because our whole society is based on prioritizing things that are deemed as necessary.
Deemed as necessary, deemed the important term.
Well, I mean, it's a mathematical term too, or a logical term, because it follows from certain premises, and one of the definitely the premises that Illich deals with in this book. If the listener will excuse the pages going past on my legal pad.
His handwriting is really...
the handwriting is terrible. The phenomenology of school. The first point is age. Children belong in school. Children learn in school. Children can only be taught in school. What are they taught? They are taught that education should result in profit for themselves. Education should result in property for themselves that they can guard against other people from getting. And this is the whole issue with schooled society. It is something that I get and you don't get. You know? It is based on a sense of exclusivity. Otherwise, in this particular system, it has no value.
Exactly, yeah. And when you have a universal kind of equivalent or measurement that renders all things equivalent, like capital, it makes it very easy to then associate the value with that piece of paper, right? The degree or whatever.
Totally.
But
it's all about measurement. Cut it like it's from cloth.
What is the Epimethean man? Because I have trouble understanding this. How do they oppose this? Because this end of the stick, right? Because the Epimethean man is indicative of hindsight in, broad terms. Where Illich says that in classical Greece, the name Epimetheus, which means hindsight, was interpreted to mean dull or dumb, almost like looking down upon. Epimetheus was looked down upon all throughout history, whereas Illich is saying, "Fuck, maybe there's something we could get from that." And I don't know what you have to think about that.
Do you mind if I dip into the personal at some point?
You can do whatever you want.
Oh, wonderful. So, my master's thesis was on accelerationism. And of course, accelerationism does praise Prometheus because it is he represents mastery, he represents foresight, he represents technology.
Mm-hmm.
So my project was an attempt to encourage an Epimethean accelerationism.
A cautious accelerationism.
Which Nick Cernicek and Mark Fisher just completely loathed. I presented a paper in front of them, and both of them were like, "This is terrible." And at that point, I was like, "Yeah, I feel like I'm doing something right with my life." When Nick Cernicek and Mark Fisher disagree with me. So I was cautious about the way that Ray Brizier's Prometheanism was included in the accelerationist reader, and my contrast to that drew on Illich pretty explicitly because he talked about Epimetheus as a sense of foresight and hindsight, but also a hope on the level of Epimetheus and expectation on the level of Prometheus. And Prometheus never really expected to be caught when he stole fire from the gods and strapped to the rock where the bird would take his liver and internal organs from him every day. So there's a limit to Prometheus's foresight where there are unexpected consequences to what was expected. And the original split between Prometheus and Epimetheus lay in the myth where Zeus said, is everything okay with the recording? Okay, good. Where Zeus said, you need to give each creature abilities. So Prometheus and Epimetheus went out into the world and gave everyone abilities. And the only creature on the world that wasn't left with any abilities like claws or camouflage was the human being. And Epimetheus was like, oh, holy shit, we should have given this creature some abilities. This is why Prometheus went up to heaven and stole the fire, and gave humanity the gift of invention, of the gift of supplementing their own lack.
Yep.
The gift of giving them institutions to make up for their own inadequacy.
Right.
But the myth of Prometheus and Epimetheus goes further for Illich to one of the myths of the flood. Okay. So at this point, the Greek myth turns into hopeful prophecy, because it tells us that the son of Prometheus was Deschooling, the helmsman of the ark, who, like Noah, my pronunciation, although I'm English and I understand words, is horrible for this moment because of wine. Don't drink. Outrode the flood to become the father of a new mankind, which he made from the earth with Pyria, the daughter of Epimetheus and Pandora. For Illich, Pandora's box is a very important myth, because the institutionalized man or person gets trapped within Pandora's box in the ordinary telling, rather than getting released with hope. We are gaining insight into the meaning of Pythos, which Pandora brought in from the gods as the inverse of the box, our vessel and ark. We now need a name for those who value hope above expectations. We need a name for those who love people more than products. And this is what Epimethean man is all about. It's about things that, or people who are not, I don't know. Let me think about this for a second. People who are not subservient to institutionalized values, I think.
Right, because
but because they understand that life goes beyond the Epimethean mistake.
Which would be what?
The Epimethean mistake is not giving humans an ability to exist by.
As opposed to Prometheus.
Well, Prometheus wanted to make sure that humans didn't suffer from this lack. Whereas the sense for Epimetheus is that what constitutes the human is this lack.
Right. Yeah.
And this lack is inescapable to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Whereas the Promethean myth is like this lack can be satisfied.
Yeah. Hence the affinity with accelerationist politics, as though we can get somewhere with our, by essentially speeding up. But I think that the way you characterized Epimethean human, man, as being...
man is still like the universal noun at this point, unfortunately. It should, I mean, If Illich was our age nowadays, he definitely used human, I think.
Yeah, he was speaking at the time. I mean, he was an old guy in 1970.
No, I mean, it's a shame. It's a shame. But at the same time, it's
what we
how it
have.
was.
But we have this idea of Epimethean man as being... Oh, here. Yeah, so we have this idea of Epimethean man, or at least the idea that I think...
But the rebirth of Epimetheus.
The rebirth, right. Because Epimetheus represents to us a sort of hesitancy. But it's not just a hesitancy in and of itself.
Right.
It is rather a hesitancy based on our... the term Illich uses is hindsight, but of our being aware...
Hope. Hindsight and hope.
There we go. About looking at other people, and as you said, Andrew, as not being like institutional cogs, but as people, as being one component of that, being one result of adopting this Epimethean attitude, which is, it's a little bit romantic, and I get what he's saying, and it resonates well with like other. Sounds like a hippie a little bit. Because what does that look like?
But he's different from the hippies, most certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Anything else? What else stands out to you?
It's certainly brave in a time where the global south and the global north are described as opposites. And on top of that, the global south is described as inferior.
Yep.
It is a book that flips the script.
Yeah.
And says, those people that you thought were inferior to you actually know what's really important.
Right.
You have prioritized the wrong things.
Yeah.
You have relieved yourself of the responsibility of thinking, of the responsibility of learning, because you think that education is aligned with learning or institutionalized education and the assignment of social roles. And this is not how people grow up. This is not how people grow up in other places. I mean, there's a point where he refers to a personal anecdote. It might be in the phenomenology of school. All I'm gonna say is that David choked after having a drink of wine, and he's not as much of a hard drinker as you might suspect. So there's this point where I have no idea where the point we left off was. But recently I was talking to my night watchman Marcos about his 11-year-old son who works in the barber shop. I noticed in Spanish that his son was still a Nino. Marco, surprised, answered with a guileless smile. Don Ivan, I guess you're right. Realizing that until my remark, the father had thought of Marcos primarily as his son, I felt guilty for having drawn the curtain of childhood between two sensible persons. And there's this sense where the idea of schooling is a very institutionalized and on a more broader sense or a westernized approach to the relations of people.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In a sense, of certain people get designated as inferior to others or more immature to others. That until very, very recently in history was not applied to other people.
Yeah.
And then she's trying to consider of how we use new technologies to combat institutionalized versions of school.
Epimethean accelerationism.
Indeed. Promethean accelerationism would just be more schooling.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. Or introducing iPads.
And would not absorb the real message of Illich. Of like. Yeah, no, I mean, although I know the accelerationists and like, apart from a lot of their published stuff, they're really smart. At the same time, I think like, well, you're obviously just misunderstanding a lot when it comes to other critical theory, like Mark Fisher would describe other critical theory as quibbling critique.
Right.
It's like, no. A lot of it is in like solidarity with what you do. You just don't get it because it's not Deleuzian-Guattarianism, you know. And that's a lot of the stuff that, you know, people who identify as accelerationists don't get. They don't get Illich. They don't get Illich because they don't understand the progressiveness within his conservatism. What appears as a conservatism, I mean.
Yeah.
I don't grapple with that a lot. They don't grapple with education apart from the idea of changing the textbooks. And a lot of that is just, you know, maintaining the same schooling system.
Yep.
Whereas, I mean, a lot in deschooling society, how do I put this? A lot of deschooling society is a premonition of the internet.
As being a space for an alternative schooling?
As being a space of connecting people.
Okay.
I don't think that Illich would want to have people connecting who weren't in the same city.
Yeah.
He's still very committed to the local because the local is the place where you can make the change for him.
Yeah.
He definitely turned against computer communication as the primary form of communication between people. I don't think he would have been opposed to the internet as a way of connecting people initially.
Yeah.
But like, it needs to move to like IRL. As soon as possible. IRL is where it makes the real change.
Yeah, well, I mean, shit, that's probably a good note to close up on.
Yeah, I've no more to say, really.
I think that was good.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, David.
For those that listen this far, I hope that you got something out of it. And if you... I say this at the end, not because it's... at the end every time. And I feel like a few people make it to the end sometimes. But for those of you that did make it to the end, if you have any problems with what we said, you know how to do it.
You can comment.
You can comment.
Or you could send us bottles of wine, and then we'll get together eventually, and then we'll talk about the problems.
Send a bottle of wine with a note attached to it,
outlining
your complaint or your question, and then we'll drink it. But we're not drunk in philosophy because that's taken already. So we just, we do this and we drink. So that's just what it is.
Yeah.
But for those that did make it this far, thank you.
Thank you.
And I hope that you enjoyed it.
I hope you read... Have you paused it?
No,
okay.
We're good.
I hope you read Illich better than us.
I hope you read Illich, period. He's an unknown thinker. He's an important person that no one reads. So
I definitely read Medical Nemesis and also ABC, The Alphabetization of the Mind, which you wrote with Barry, and really was my introduction to Illich, and I think it's a great book for people who are not familiar with medievalism or the epistemic shift between orality and literacy. Those are both great books.
yeah.
You should read Barry Sanders, I think, generally, because his books are great. But also Illich, because when you read Illich, you're like, oh, I see where Barry got his points.
Right.
But that might have been an experience of someone who had Barry as a student.
Right, yeah.
Illich is very influential, and you should just read them. Period, because even though people don't think you should.
Yeah, no, well, definitely go and read them. And if you're not reading anything currently, if you've gotten anything from this, go read things. It's important. But on that note, take care.